Welcome, everybody, to our episode on looking at extended response. I am Mellisa Smith.
And I'm Serena Halstead.
And I'm Spencer Ziegler. And so, we're continuing. Last episode, we talked about selected response. Today, we're going to focus on extended response before jumping into personal communication and performance assessment. And I'm excited to talk about extended response. I think it's a really interesting assessment method, and it can reveal a lot. So when I think about extended written response, I think back to my first couple years teaching. I was teaching middle school social studies up in Massachusetts. And as we talked about in the last episode, when I thought about assessment, I tended to think about selected response. But I remember I was paired with this fantastic language arts teacher that encouraged me to lean on some extended written response from time to time when the situation called for it. And when I did so, I remember just that there were certain kids that they were able to show me something about their understanding of the standards through writing that wasn't coming out in my other assessment methods. And that to me early on kind of showed me the power of extended response. But also I found that there were times in which it wasn't quite doing what I wanted as well. So we're going to kind of unpack that in this episode, looking at what extended response can do and how it can give kids some meaningful feedback. So starting with definition, which is coming from Classroom Assessment for Student Learning. And the definition we're working with for extended written response is items which require a written answer, so at least several sentences in length, in response to a question or task. And for this assessment method, correctness is going to be judged against predetermined criteria on a checklist or rubric. So right there, you got kind of a big difference between what we talked about last episode with selected response and what we're talking about here with extended written response. What do you guys think extended written response is useful for? What are the uses of this assessment method?
So in terms of the with a selected response, even though the student, you select the right answer, it doesn't tell me how much do you really know about what, even though you get that answer, it doesn't tell me to the extent of how much you know it. So with the extended response, it gives an opportunity for students to say more. That extended piece, I can, as a teacher, looking at, evaluating what you know, I can clearly tell from a extended response, do you really know this thing, right? Or is it just a lucky guess in terms of a selected response? So I can clearly tell how competent you are with what you know.
Mm-hmm.
For me, extended response is, the kind of, it's the type of assessment that I prefer because I get to show the teacher what I know as opposed to trying to figure out through their choices and not knowing which choice to choose. So I always find it's one where, again, I get to give a little bit more detail and I feel as though I have more control. And I like to use it as one. So as a math teacher, it was one that I figured out that initially when I'm teaching, it's a good one to kind of get the students thinking, especially when it comes to math. Most often students think very differently from how I think about math. And so to be able to reach them where they are, I need to know where their starting point is. So using extended response, and I know most times when we think of extended response, we think it's going to be like in the language arts or social studies or maybe science. And you think, well, I can't use extended response in math. But it is very interesting to use it in places like that where you're trying to get at their thinking, to try to have a better understanding of where they're coming from. And so I find it very advantageous to use extended response in that way.
That's a good point. And in that Classroom Assessment for Student Learning book, they talk about that metacognition piece and how it can be a good choice for assessing reasoning targets, and that students can be encouraged to write to examine their own thinking. So I like that as they're kind of writing out their thoughts, that can help them to maybe tap into something and also to reflect on how they're thinking and how they're learning. So I think that can be a use for extended response. They also say in that book that it's useful for assessing blocks of knowledge rather than pieces of information detached from one another. So I think that's another example of selected response can be helpful for those discrete pieces of learning that you can divide into 2, 3, 4 different options, whereas extended response can be more beneficial for those blocks of knowledge.
Agreed.
Yeah.
And I also found that then as a teacher, when I looked at extended response, I can use some of that thinking or misunderstanding to better form my distractors when I was trying to build, my multiple choice or true false.
That's a great point, how the different assessment methods can inform each other. I like that idea.
Yeah, I like that.
Yeah. And when, it always comes back to the standards and looking at some of the verbs in the standards that might kind of give you an idea of when extended response is going to be helpful. So when the standards are using some of the verbs they're talking about, applying or analyzing or evaluating, that might be a signal,
right?
Yeah, that the extended response is going to be a helpful way to get at that information. Likewise, if you're on the receiving end of these assessments and not kind of building them yourself, when you see an extended response, just to know that this is going to inform your students' ability to do those things, so you know what data it's going to be giving you.
And I know as a teacher, when I see extended response, I kind of get that feeling like, oh my God, right, that it's sort of subjective, especially if we're, in that sort of area where my students' results are being compared to yours or others.
Yep.
And so, you kind of get this false sense that, well, if we give a multiple choice, that is somehow fair or more valid than if we do an extended written response, right? Because then how am I so sure that you're not judging your kids differently from how I'm judging my kids? So it also has that element as well for teachers.
Right. And even though we know that, with an extended written response, we definitely have our rubrics or, our scoring guide, even though that scoring guide is there and we might agree on it initially as to how we're going to be scoring. When we actually start, if we have having to compare how your students perform to mine, sometimes we tend to go, trip upon that rubric. We tend not to want to accept that level that you were going to give. No, well, I think this could be a 2. No, give it a 2.5 because now we're now comparing, students, comparing our class performance. So, that extended response, it opens up a lot of conversation in terms of how are we judging our students' knowledge for the teachers. And another thing I wanted to touch on with extended response, Mellisa has been talking more so on the teacher side of it, but on the student side of it, what does that look like, feel like for the student? I'm just thinking about, students who they have the content knowledge, but not necessarily the written part to it. They're not competent writers. They can express themselves, right? Definitely express themselves. But when it comes to putting that, grammatically correct sentence, that spelling and all of that, kids get so trapped into doing that they not necessarily respond. Even though they know the answer, they did not give that perfect response because of other things being tied to responding to what you're asking.
I think that's a really good point. And it goes back to, what are you trying to measure? What standards are you trying to tap into? Obviously, if you're looking at writing standards, then extended response is a natural spot to do it. But if all you're really trying to measure is whether students understand the difference between producers, consumers, and decomposers, do I have that right?
Yes.
Yeah, someone will tell me if not. Okay, thanks.
Yes.
Then a student's not only writing skill, but just relationship with writing and history with school and their thoughts towards writing could at times kind of detract from your ability to gauge, do they understand what a producer, consumer, decomposer is? So I think that's a really important thing to be cognizant of when you're working with extended response.
Mm-hmm.
In our next episode, we're going to talk about personal communication. And I think you can sometimes perhaps have a pairing with extended response and personal communication. And at times, just whichever assessment method and a student's going to be able to better demonstrate their understanding of those standards, then that might give you an option. So not everything has to be just one assessment method. Sometimes some choice in how you're letting kids demonstrate what they know can be helpful.
So when we think of the feedback elements, right, it seems as though extended response causes us to then think of the timeliness, right? Because again, if you're having to look at a rubric and then score the work, that is going to take up time. And it also causes us to consider the consistency, right? We've sort of touched on that element of, am I being consistent even within myself when I'm starting to score students' response far less for, across teachers. So I think when we're thinking of our feedback elements, it is important to know that to consider how does timeliness and consistency being affected when you're using extended written response.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true. And just knowing and just kind of being aware of how much time it's going to take you to kind of give feedback through writing. It takes some time. But leaning on the rubrics so that kids can give themselves feedback and give each other feedback when able. There's a good article on ASCD. Good feedback is targeted, specific, timely. We'll drop it in the show notes. It actually points out that when students are acquiring new complex knowledge or skills, real-time checks for understanding and tips can prevent them from developing misconceptions or incorrect practices. So that goes to that selected response where we want that immediate kind of feedback. But they go on, but when they're extending and applying knowledge, for example, writing an essay or solving a complex theorem, delaying feedback somewhat can enable them to self-correct, develop perseverance, and take responsibility for their own learning objectives. So I think that's a key point, that not all the feedback needs to come directly from the teacher. So knowing that your feedback as an educator might not be timely, but if you teach them how to use that rubric, they might be able to give themselves some timely feedback.
Definitely.
One element of feedback where I think extended response can really shine, and we kind of touched on this a little bit before, is that actionable piece. Because you're able to get a glimpse into their thinking, you can give them a little bit more specific advice for what they can do next. So I think it can be a little bit more empowering than just looking at a number that tells you your understanding can be.
Yeah, I like that. I agree with that one.
And then that user-friendly aspect of feedback, that partially depends on how that assessment method is used and administered and communicated. And as we discussed, the student's relationship with writing. So the user-friendly, this assessment method can be really user-friendly depending on the context, or it might struggle there, and that might be something to be aware of as you're working with kids on their writing.
And of course, like I said, depending on the class, this is not something where on day one the kids are perfectly communicating their thoughts, right? It's a skill that kids need, because like you pointed out, Serena, it's hard, it takes a while. You might know what it is you want to say, but how do you communicate that either by words or written? That takes time. And so just to be patient with themselves and with their class, because again, the more you do it and more you show the students what you're looking for, the better it'll become later on.
And, as Spencer pointed out, something about it gives you just a glimpse of what the students know, because like I said, other things about other limitations that the student has can mask what they really know in their writing, right? So it gives you just a glimpse, but then it goes back to the teacher being that expert. I think the more the teacher, play around with this content, the more they've seen different samples of students' work in response to a task that they're giving them. I think that the timeliness of the feedback will change, right? So if I've given this task more than once and I know the content of what I'm looking for in the student's writing, that teacher is better able to quickly, give that feedback. But for a teacher who doesn't necessarily, I wouldn't say not know the content, but I've not seen the different styles and way students can respond, that will take them some time to, provide that timely feedback for students.
So I'd say as we're going through the series to think about some of the relationships between the different assessment methods. So as you come across each, you know what they're going to offer you as an educator. So talking last episode, we looked at selected response and extended response, and we talked a little bit about the differences in timeliness. So I think being aware of what each offer in that area can be helpful. Likewise, after this extended response episode, we're going to personal communication. And that might be something that you think of in terms of how kids can show you what they know. So the hope is that with this assessment method series, that gives you an idea of what each method can offer you as an educator so that you can use them to better reach and teach your kids. So in that next episode, we'll dive into personal communication. As always, if you have any questions, comments, or you want to check out further notes on the episodes, you can track us down at www.wcpss.net/datalit. And thanks for tuning in.